who have less than optimal quality of life because they don't get the care that they need, whether it's a preventive care or emergency care or ongoing care for chronic conditions or whatever. That is, many have said, but it's just a simple truth. When you look around the world, it's fairly rare for an advanced country as we are. Most all other advanced countries, advanced economies, and so forth, have universal health coverage. Some, it's a sort of a single-payer system. Others, it's not a single-payer system. It involves insurance, but with a high amount of regulation. Some places it's nonprofit, some places it's for-profit, but they have managed to square this circle of how to cover everybody. So this is the situation that we were facing, a big part of it. Now, the other thing I'll mention just very briefly is for people who had insurance, there were all kinds of problems. You could get sick and all of a sudden lose it. You sort of wonder, how can that happen? But companies are pretty adept at finding loopholes or something you didn't tell them about or some problem, and then all of a sudden the coverage is gone when you need it. So that's not very fair or effective. We know that a lot of people can't get into the insurance system. I had a conversation last week with a university president. Now, this guy makes a lot of money compared to most of us. Had a daughter with MS. Couldn't get her insured. So, there are situations where people with all the wealth and other indicia of success and productivity and everything else have been blocked out of this market. A tragedy, but it happens each and every day. So people are blocked out for those things. Costs have gone way up. They keep going up. And we get into this thing, somebody called it a death spiral, but what happens is this. We have a system, you don't have to be in it. So the costs go higher. The people at the lower end, like my son, people in their 20s or early 30s are saying, you know what, this is expensive. I don't have to have this. I'll take a crapshoot, if you will, and I'll just exit the system and take my chances, because they assume that they're healthy and they're nothing bad's going to happen to them, and it may not, but it might. And what they're also assuming, consciously or unconsciously, is if something bad does happen to me, guess what? There's an emergency room there that I can go to, and there are EMTs that will, if I need, that I'm not paying for, but they'll be there because we don't let people normally, if we know about it, drop dead in the street or whatever. So people assume they're going to be taken care of by systems that they're not helping to pay for. And they're right about the first part of it, and the second part of it is really not fair. So this is the kind of situation, or some of the pieces of the situation. There are many others that, and I guess let me say a brief word about small businesses. Small businesses in Ohio right now, we know this from a very recent professional poll that was taken, that half of small businesses in Ohio roughly provide coverage at all. And if you get down below that total to small businesses that have fewer than 10 employees, which is really the majority of small businesses, are small, they have 10 or fewer employees, 30% of them are providing insurance today. So 70% are not. That's the situation that we're facing out there. And cost, what happens is, and we've seen this at Legal Aid, when they look at your system, they look at you and those few employees. And if somebody gets sick, they kind of screw it up for everybody. I mean, we had a woman who told this tragic story at one of our press conferences, and Ed knows about this, a few months ago, where she had contracted cancer, and her employer said, would you please get off our health insurance program? You're causing everybody's premiums to go up 300% or something. Or a good of $300, maybe not 300%, but $300. And so she did. And she said it was a disaster. She had no idea what she was doing. But she was made to feel so bad because she was sick. And it was affecting her fellow colleagues and employees that she got off, and then consequently she couldn't get back on virtually anywhere. So there's been much unfairness in this. Enough about that. So what did we do? We've finally done something about it. first thing to understand is what's going on in Congress. The short version is the House passed a bill after much debate. I can't remember exactly when, but back in the late fall. And then we went to the Senate, and the Senate passed a bill, you will remember, on Christmas Eve. And then we sat there for a while, and things kind of played out. And then what happened was, that's the way legislation goes. It goes from one house to the other. Usually there were changes in the Senate, and then it has to go back and be reapproved by the other house. Or they have to go to what's called a conference committee, and they have to compromise between the two, and then that compromise bill has to go back and be approved by both houses. Well, what happened was, if you were writing a book, this would be a great plot. But shortly after the Senate voted, and before the House could adopt the Senate bill, but change it and send it back to the Senate and get changes, before any of that could happen, the Massachusetts election happened, and the Democrats lost their 60-vote supermajority in the Senate. Became a real problem. They weren't going to be able to fix anything the House sent over. So the House was confronted with the notion of, okay, what do we do? Nothing, or adopt the Senate bill, parts of which they hated, like the so-called Nebraska deal. They call it Nebraska something or other, corn something or other, that allowed them to not ever pay for Medicaid ever, and some of those kind of deals, which quite candidly are very common in the legislative process, but they're usually not so transparent for everybody to see. But this one with Ben Nelson played out in front of the public, and people hated it. I mean, it really was upsetting to people, including many House members. So there were those kinds of things and some other things that the House really disliked about the Senate bill. And of course, one of them, as you all well know, because of Steve Greenhouse's concerns here, where it's about the abortion language. I'm going to say very little about that. That's not anything that we have any expertise in, and so I have no axe to grind about that, and frankly don't know a whole lot about what the specifics of the language were, other than that the attempt, I think, on both sides was to make sure that federal funding was not used for abortion. But on the Senate side, the language wasn't deemed quite tight enough, so there were objections to that on the part of the bishops and some others. And that really helped tie things up for a while. But basically what was confronting the House was, are we going to adopt this Senate bill, or does this thing stop? And so, as you all know, some of you probably like me were watching television last Sunday, for at least part of the day. A pretty historic thing happened, and the House adopted the Senate bill, but with an understanding that they would agree on a separate bill that would fix a few things through this process called reconciliation. There's been a lot said about this. Does everybody understand what that is? It's a way that you can vote in the Senate and get around the problem of the filibuster and be able to vote a bill with a 51-vote majority. But you can only do that for things that affect the budget or affect expenditures. So it's not a legislative measure or mechanism that you can use for everything. For instance, there was no way to use it to try to solve the abortion language problem. But after a lot of consideration, the Senate said, okay, this is what we can do, this is what we must do, this is what we're going to do, and we will fix this bill if the House will vote for it. So they really had to be a measure of trust there that's not always there. In fact, the House members said, we want to see it in writing. We want to see a letter signed by 50 or more senators that you'll do this. So they got that. They actually got that letter.